Well, I want to visit with you today about my philosophy of ministry. One of the things that we have asked you as staff members in particular to do is to talk about among each other and with us as a group about your purpose for ministry and how you're leading different areas in ministry in our church and how they connect to the grander purpose of our church. And so I've not participated in that conversation yet as your pastor. I've really just listened and I've read what our staff members have to say about that. So today is my chance to share with you my philosophy of ministry as your pastor, as the pastor of this church. And what I hope it will do for you is to help answer any questions you might have about why I do some of the things that I do. Let me think about that. It's not going to answer all of those questions, okay? Because you may still leave after watching this or being here still wondering why I do some of the things I do. But perhaps some of those questions you have will be answered today, and that's really the goal. So I want to begin with some pastoral considerations. And I realize that all of us have pastoral responsibilities at this church if you serve on this church staff. If you're a leader in this church, there's a connection you have to pastoral care ministry in this body. But I think all of us agree that I play a unique role in the life of this church as the pastor of this congregation. And so I want to share with you today my philosophy of ministry as your pastor, and I want to begin with some pastoral considerations. I want to start with pastoral responsibilities. What are the responsibilities of the pastor? Well, answering that question probably depends on who you ask. Everybody has a certain sense of who the pastor is and what the pastor is supposed to be doing. And I can promise you that I spend a good bit of time thinking about this question. What are the responsibilities of the pastor? There's another question. Do those responsibilities vary from church to church? And maybe even one other question that's significant as well. Does the size of the church have any impact on the central functions of the office of the pastor? Now, I have the advantage of having pastored several churches, and so I can answer some of these questions, I believe, at least based on my experience. When you ask the question, what is the principal function of the pastor? Well, obviously, I would probably say to provide spiritual oversight and pastoral care for the church. That's what the pastor does. Does that responsibility vary from church to church? Well, yes, it does. Y'all have heard me talk a little bit about the very first church I pastored in Jimtown, Oklahoma. In fact, I shared a little bit of the story the other night in church, and I had a lady ask me, "Were you telling the truth about those things?" Now, I wasn't really quite sure how to take that question because I thought it might imply that maybe I don't always tell the truth, but she just couldn't believe what our life was like in those early days because that first church I pastored, it was in Oklahoma and I was in seminary, and we drove back and forth every weekend, and I was working a job in Fort Worth and so was Cindy and going to school. And as I've shared with some of you before, the church didn't have a parsonage, so we actually slept in the church. And the church bought us a couch that folded out into a bed, but it was located in the Sunday school room where Cindy and I taught Sunday school. So whenever we would get up in the morning, we had to clean up as best we could and then go down the road and take a shower at one of the church members' homes and then come back and teach Sunday school in that place where we had spent the night. And then when we moved to our next church in Mertens, it was also a rural congregation. Well, we mowed the lawn. The church didn't have anybody that took care of the property and the building, and so Cindy and I did that. We took care of the outside of the property. I filled the baptistry, sometimes overfilled the baptistry, and those created moments of panic. Anyway, so and what was interesting was, is as much as I love that little congregation, that was kind of their standard expectation. The pastor lived in the parsonage right next door to the church, so it just stood to reason if he was going to mow his lawn, he might as well go ahead and mow the lawn of the whole church. There was a whole other acre sitting there that needed to be mowed, but they didn't see a need for a church member to come down and mow that grass when I'm already there. So, and I felt like that was exactly what should happen. So Cindy ended up having to mow it because I felt like, that was one of the ways she could help me as my helpmate. So together we did that, and I don't know how you connect that to the office of the pastor in that church, but in their minds it was connected, that it was part of my responsibility just to take care of stuff. And so when it came time to baptize someone, I was the one that had to fill the baptistry up, and I had the keys, and so I opened and closed the buildings, and I mean those were just expectations. And so I don't think there's any question that when you're in one church, they have certain expectations of the role that I play. You're in another church, they have another set of expectations. It's just how it is. But then this third question, I think, is one that's probably really important to me, and that is, how about the size of the church? Does that have any impact on the central function of the pastor's role? Well, I think I would tell you that the answer to that question is both yes and no. In a sense, the answer is no. It doesn't really matter how large or small the church is, because the pastor has a certain set of responsibilities, period. And it really doesn't matter how many people are showing up on the campus when it comes to the basic central function of spiritual oversight and providing pastoral care for the people. However, what I would say, though, is the answer is yes when you think about how that's lived out practically. For example, the first couple of churches I pastored, first 3 churches actually I pastored, when you have less than 100 people that you're trying to provide oversight for and pastoral care for, you're very connected to them, and they're very connected to you, and you're involved in just about everything that happens to them. Well, think about where we are as a church today. On a Sunday morning, as the pastor at First Baptist Arlington, when you have 2,500 people in the sanctuary for worship, you've got another 3,500 people who are gathered in our Mission Arlington congregations, and at the end of the day, I'm the pastor over all of that and all of those people, responsible for the pastoral care of all of them. Well, from a practical perspective, how's that lived out? Well, it's much different than it was when I was in Jimtown, Oklahoma. I can promise you. It's a different dynamic. Perhaps what might be a more pertinent question would be this one. Do you find that the expectations of the individual congregation members change when churches are larger? I think the answer to the question is yes. The expectations of the people change, but the central function doesn't change. Now, one of my favorite authors is Eugene Peterson, and Eugene Peterson has issued a pretty scathing indictment of people in my position. This is what he says. American pastors are abandoning their posts left and right, and at an alarming rate. They are not leaving their churches and getting other jobs. Congregations still pay their salaries. Their names remain on the church stationery, and they continue to appear in pulpits on Sundays. But they are abandoning their posts, their calling. They've gone whoring after other gods. What they do with their time under the guise of pastoral ministry hasn't the remotest connection with what the church's pastors have done for most of 20 centuries. Now, from a guy that I tremendously respect, that's quite an assessment of people in my shoes. And if you've read Peterson much, even in his recent writings, he has some pretty sharp criticism for pastors of what he calls mega churches. And ours would qualify based on his definition of a mega church. And Peterson issues a pretty strong scolding for people like me and the way that I live out my pastoral care role without necessarily knowing me personally. He's just speaking categorically when he looks at what pastors are doing. I wonder why he says that kind of thing. Why would he make such an indictment? Particularly a guy like him who's not, he's not some obscurantist. I mean, Eugene Peterson's a pretty stable, solid person. And I think what Peterson is saying to us is, as I've read more of his writings, is that he feels like that pastors have become more like CEOs of giant corporations, and they're as interested in marketing as they are anything else. And so he blames the culture and he blames the pastors for creating a consumer mindset among contemporary Christians in America. He says that the pastors are market driven and all they're doing is fueling that consumer mentality. And in fact, he has an interesting quote in one of his books. He says, "There's no such thing as a successful church." He says that does not exist. He said the only thing that exists is a company of sinners gathered in any particular location trying to figure out how to follow the way of Jesus. He said that's the only thing that really exists. He said that's what the church is. He says, so when we talk about being successful, he feels like, as I understand him, if you use the wrong measuring tools, there is no hope. So, I've given a lot of thought about this, and I have a lot of respect for him. Let me talk to you about my pastoral mentors, the men that have shaped my understanding of what it means to do what I do. There have been a lot of them. But the ones who have had lasting influence on me, particularly in my early days, Clyde Meredith is the first one. He was my boyhood pastor in Birmingham. And in my mind, when you look up pastor in the dictionary, it has Brother Meredith's picture. He was just a man of God, lived in our community, and he loved us, loved the people in our church, and he was a true mentor to me and a pastor to my family. And I love Brother Meredith. He's gone on to be with the Lord now, but I was able to visit with him in his older years and thank him for the role that he played in my life, because he has helped shape what I understand pastoral care is supposed to be about. He was, to me, the epitome of pastoral care, or as my brother says, Emerson, he pronounces that epitome, but anyway, it's actually epitome. So maybe he'll watch this one day and it'll be helpful. Then Jerry Curry and Ben Hayden. Jerry Curry was the pastor of our church when I was in college, and Jerry Curry was a preacher. I mean, he was the first person besides Angel Martinez that we had in our church that just captured my attention in the pulpit. And Jerry Curry showed up as a preacher. And then when I began to really have some pretty serious intellectual questions about Christianity, and while I was in college, and really began to fall away from the church some, I found a radio preacher, Ben Hayden. He was a Presbyterian minister out of Chattanooga, Tennessee. And he had been an attorney prior to going into the ministry. He had a unique delivery style, but he was an incredible preacher. And I started listening to him on Saturday nights on the radio. And he's one of the men that really brought me back intellectually to my understanding of Christianity. But he really shaped my understanding of preaching and the power of preaching, because he was a powerful preacher. I never had the chance to meet him personally, so I have no idea what he was like personally. I just know that he was an incredible communicator, and Brother Curry was as well. And then Paul Powell. Many of you know about my relationship with Paul. Paul has influenced me because of his visionary leadership and his challenge to me as the pastor to lead with vision and to challenge the church to move beyond where it is and move toward where it could be. So when I look at my life as a pastor, I can tell you that these 3 or 4 men come to my mind almost every day because I remember the way that they have influenced me. And I think about them. Now, I don't wear a bracelet that says, what would Paul Powell do, or what would Clyde Meredith do. But I will tell you, there are times when I think about what they did, and it certainly influences what I do. And so I'm grateful for their mentorship in my life. Now, obviously, there are biblical imageries. Y'all know that. There are 3 primary ones that have influenced me as I look at the text. The Bible has a lot to say about the qualifications of the pastor. Doesn't always give you a whole lot of insight about the responsibilities of the pastor, except for with some of the words that it uses. The word overseer is used. The Greek word is episkopos, and that's a powerful word. Has a strong image connected to it. And I believe a part of the pastor's responsibility is being an overseer. In fact, Paul told Timothy, if anybody desires to be an overseer, that's a noble task. So it's a noble responsibility in the church. And then a shepherd. Peter challenged the leaders in the churches in Asia Minor to shepherd the congregations with humility, to see themselves as under shepherds, because there is a great shepherd who is the one who leads all of us. And certainly in preaching and teaching, there's the encouragement that Paul gives to Timothy to preach the Word of God, and certainly I believe that's a part of the responsibility of the pastor. So those are the biblical images. Now I want to share with you just some personal commitments that I want to make to you as your pastor, just so you'll know. These are things that I would tell you I'm going to continue to pledge to do as I try to provide oversight for our church as your pastor. The first one is I'm going to be authentic. That means that I have what I would call an earthy spirituality. and I mean that in the most positive way that I know to say it. But I don't know any other way to be than to just be authentic. And so I'm going to continue to live my life in your midst. And I'm going to be honest about how I do it. I don't know everything there is to know. And I have questions sometimes that I struggle with, and I have very real life issues that I face as a human being. And I know that I'm earthy. The Lord and I had numerous conversations about that in my early days of being called in the ministry. So I've come to grips with that. I just know that's who I am, and I'm going to continue to be that way. Okay? I want to be biblical. I'm going to attend to the Scriptures. I believe in the power of the Word of God. I've said to you before, I spend a lot of time in first century world simply because I'm drawn to the New Testament. I'm drawn to the period in Israel's life when the temple was rebuilt and God's people came back home. Some theologians and scholars say that Israel was never more the people of God than they were during that era in their life. They didn't have a king. They really didn't have that kind of political leadership, the theocracy that they had dreamed of and had lived out in the past. They were drawn together by the law and by the temple. And so Second Temple Judaism to me is very different than First Temple Judaism. And that's the Judaism that Jesus is going to encounter. And it had a certain richness to it, I believe. And sometimes I think it's even been sold short. Sometimes I think that we paint such a strong picture of legalism that we don't do it justice. There were some incredibly pious people in Second Temple Judaism. And many of those people were the early followers of Jesus. And so I spent a lot of time in that era in the history of the world, and spent a lot of time in the first century, and I'm going to continue to. Now that doesn't mean that I don't read all of the Old Testament. Of course I do. I believe it's the Word of God. But at the same time, I'm just being honest with you, my world in many days is spent in the first century as I'm listening to Jesus and people like Paul. I'm going to continue to be theologically thoughtful. I have certain theological convictions that I've settled in my heart, but there are others that I still grapple with, and I'm going to continue to think through them. I'm going to be approachable. Again, I don't know any other way to live than to be approachable, and hopefully that speaks to our church members as well as our staff members. I want to be prayerful. I realize that this enterprise is something that's too big for any of us to do without God's help and God's intervention, and so I try to be prayerful in everything that I do. I want God's direction in my life. I want God's direction for our church. I don't want to just lean on my own understanding and my ability to think through issues. I want God to guide me. And I've already said I have an earthly spirituality about me, but just to circle back around and say I really do want to be a spiritual person. That's how I'm wired. That's just how God leads me, and I'm grateful for that. I'm going to be pastoral. I can just tell you, as the pastor of your church, I'm going to continue to love you and be a part of your life, and as best I can, pastor all of you. That's certainly my desire. It's a challenge to do in a church our size, but I'm amazed at how God gives us gifts when we need them to care for people, and so I'm going to continue to try to do that, and as best I know how to do it. This next one will shock you, but I'm going to be vocal. Again, I don't know any other way to be. If there's something that I believe I'm supposed to speak into, I'm going to speak into it. One of the worst things I believe that leaders can do is to be quiet when something needs to be said. And so I'm going to be vocal, and I'm going to be a leader. I believe that's one of the spiritual gifts that God has given me is leadership. And that's why I love what Paul says in Romans. He says, if you've been given the gift of leadership, lead. That's a pretty strong admonition, and it's real clear. It's easy to understand. You don't even have to read Greek to understand that. If you've been given the gift of leadership, lead. So those are my commitments to you as your pastor, whether you're a staff member or a lay leader in the church. That gives you some insight into who I am. Now I would like to share with you for the next little while what my goals are for this church. The first one is biblical literacy. If you were to ask me, what is it that you want to see happen at First Baptist Arlington? What are the goals that drive you as the pastor of the church? I would tell you one of my first goals is biblical literacy. It's unfortunate that we live in an era of illiteracy biblically. In fact, it's almost inexcusable because the availability of biblical material has to be at an all-time high. I can't imagine another era in human history when the Bible was more available than it is right now. There are thousands of translations available to people in multiple languages. In fact, almost every time I go to my Bible that's on my phone, before I can even open my Bible, it'll tell me about 20 more translations that have been downloaded. You know, I mean, it's amazing to me how available the Scripture is. And so, however, even in the midst of that, with all these online editions and study Bibles and Bible studies, generally speaking, many of today's Christians are just not biblically literate. And because of that, there are all kinds of things that are lacking. In fact, George Barna has just published a pretty serious synopsis of all this, and I just read some of his conclusions based on his most recent surveys about this very topic, about biblical literacy and spiritual maturity. And he says things like less than 1 out of every 5 born-again adults has a biblical worldview. 19% of adult Christians in America say that they have a biblical worldview. Just half of all self-identified Christians firmly believe the Bible is totally accurate in all of its principles that it teaches. In other words, Barna asked American Christians in this survey, do you believe the Bible is totally accurate in its principles? Not in all of its facts, but just in principle. And about half of American Christians said yes. That means another half said no. They don't think the Bible is even trustworthy. 27% of American Christians believe that Satan exists. Less than 4 out of 10 of every 10 self-identified Christians firmly accept the teaching that a person can be influenced by spiritual forces such as angels or demons. I mean, in other words, Barna's research just seems to indicate that there's just a lack of attention given to the biblical material. And so, what I would say is, one of my goals as the pastor of First Baptist Arlington is to battle biblical illiteracy. So I just want to encourage our people just to read the text. That's the first thing. Just, to just spend some time reading the Bible. To become acquainted with the world of the Bible. That's one of the things that I'm asking our folks to do, become conversant with the stories of the Bible, to grasp the grand themes of the Bible. Those are the kinds of things that I want to see happen, to make the appropriate connections. Several writers that I've read in the past, when they talk about reading the Bible, they say that there's a difference between reading the Bible and listening to God. And I think that's true. I would agree with that. I think there is a difference between reading the Bible and listening to God. But I would submit to you that you can't listen to God without reading the Bible. I think that's just got to happen. Cultivating the ability to listen to God's voice is not going to happen if we don't have a steady diet of the text. So I want our church members to capture the big story. I want them to see the grand sweeping message of the Bible, the great plan of redemption. And so I'll just want you to know, as your pastor, I can promise you one of the things that I think about often is how to encourage and foster biblical literacy in the life of our church. Second, another goal for me is doctrinal competency. Again, another area that concerns me is the lack of doctrinal competency in people's lives. Here's what's interesting about 21st century American Christians. It's not that American Christians today don't believe anything. That's not true. The problem is what they believe. Because we live in an era of eclecticism. In other words, American Christians do theology the way they grocery shop. And they tend to just search the aisles of the theological offerings and take what they want and what they like. And if they hear an opinion that sounds good to them, that resonates with them, many American Christians just buy that view, hook, line, and sinker, without really giving it much thought, without filtering it through the Scripture. And so it's alarming to me what some people believe who claim to be Christians. And I know Cindy and I, we've spent some time with some college kids and some young adults in multiple settings, not just in our church at First Baptist, but I mean across the board. And we've been surprised at how many of them can't really articulate theological conviction. And so one of my goals is to help our church in the midst of competing theologies. I know we live in an era of tolerance. And when you take a position doctrinally, that means that you're ruling out other positions. And that's just, for some people in our era of Christianity, that's emotionally hard to do because it feels very hard line in people's lives. But you know, I guess what I'd say to y'all is I don't care. Because we've got to develop doctrinal competency in the lives of our people. We've got to embrace biblical authority, and so I'm going to continue to do that. And it's not just biblical authority. It is biblical authority, but it's also theological orthodoxy that's been worked out over time in the history of the church, and it's our confessional heritage as Baptists. All of those are important to me when you're trying to help people develop a certain level of competency doctrinally. And so I'm going to continue to encourage our folks. I think that doctrinal competency serves as a filter for your life. And it builds stability at the very core of who you are. And it helps you, it enables you to develop a worldview that's biblical. So just know that one of my goals is to help our church be competent in its understanding of Christian doctrine. And then a third goal for me is spiritual maturity. When you read the New Testament, over and over and over again, we're admonished to grow, to mature, to develop, to grow into something that we are not yet. And so as your pastor, I can promise you this is very important to me, to encourage believers to grow. There's the imagery of growing and learning and walking with God. All those kinds of things are woven into the New Testament description of what it means to be a believer. Again, we live in an era where that's a challenge. In Barna's latest book, he talks about this very dilemma. And some of y'all may have seen some of his research, but George Barna has isolated what he calls 10 stops on the journey of transformation. Let me just run through them real quickly. He says you have to walk, this is his conviction about spiritual transformation, spiritual formation. He says you need to walk through each one of these stops, as he calls them, if you really want to be a mature Christian. He says, first of all, there's what he calls the ignorance of sin. He says if you don't get past that, then if you don't really know you're a sinner, then there's really going to be no hope for you as a person who can move past that particular stop. Second, indifference to sin. He says there are some people who are not ignorant of their sin, they're just indifferent to it. Third, you move to the point of being concerned for sin. And then fourth, understand a need for forgiveness. And then fifth, embrace grace and a need to grow in faith. Now here's what's interesting. Barna says about 89% of Christians in the U.S. stop at that stop. He goes on, 6, to be spiritually discontent. He says for a Christian to grow and be transformed, once they become a follower of Jesus, they've got to have some discontentment in their lives spiritually that motivates them to move forward. Brokenness. People begin to realize that they need God. They need God's power. They need God's people. Stop number 8, surrender and submission. Barna says that the growing, thriving follower of Jesus comes to the place where they finally say, I surrender. I'm submitting myself to the will of God. Number 9, a profound love for God. And number 10, a profound love for other people. So Barna says, as he looks at spiritual transformation, those are the 10 stops that you walk through, and he says the overwhelming majority of Christians never make it past level 5. Well, I don't know that I completely agree with everything that Barna says about that. You know, it's not like I've done extensive research into those things, and I don't even know that I would agree with him that those are the 10 stops. But I would say this, my general assessment, though, is that we do live in an era where spiritual maturity is the exception rather than the norm. And so what I want you to know is, as your pastor, I'm not satisfied with that. I'm not satisfied with it in our church. I'm not satisfied with, in particular, I'm not satisfied with it in the church in general, across the board, church with a big C. A part of my responsibility as a pastor, I believe, is to encourage people to grow spiritually. So I'm trying to foster spiritual maturity in this local body of believers. And it's one of the goals that I have as your pastor. Fourth, another goal, missional community. Now this is a multifaceted goal, and we could spend a lot of time and energy on this one, but I want you to know it is one of my goals that drives me. I want our church to be missional. I want our people in our church to be missional. If you're a leader in this church, I want you to understand your mission. I want you to understand the mission of the church. I want you to have a sense of God's calling on your life. As staff members in this church, I want you to be missional. I want you to have an understanding of the mission of God for you, God's call on your life. And I want that mission to be connected to the mission of the church, to God's people. Who has God called us to be as His people? And so the church has got to be on target. The church has got to understand its mission. And so one of my responsibilities as a pastor is to make sure that the church understands its mission, and that we build a community of people who are invested in that mission. But I want individual members of this body to understand their mission. And so I want us to have opportunities for those kinds of conversations, and for the people in our church to connect their understanding of mission to the mission of God in their lives. I want you as staff members to see your ministries connected to the mission of this church. That somehow you plug in your particular ministry area plugs into the overall mission of First Baptist Arlington. And that the gospel is going to be proclaimed here in Arlington. But when I say missional community, I also mean that I want us to embrace the whole world and to realize it's a part of our responsibility to live in a broader community than just the people in Arlington. We've got to be a part of the global body of Christ, connected to the right people and having the right partners, proclaiming the right message. And so missional community is incredibly important to me. Us living together in community, journeying together with one another as followers of Jesus. So for me, one of the goals I have is to foster missional community for this church, missional living. Our people need to learn how to live in community with one another. They need to learn how to live in small groups with each other. Because as we continue to grow as a church, as we reach more people, it's imperative that we keep those people plugged into life. They are plugged into community with one another. And that community needs to have a certain mission to it. It doesn't need to just be fellowship in and of itself. We do need that. But this is something deeper than that. This is fellowship that's united around mission. And having that understanding of a missional calling helps to unite us. And then one other goal that I would share with you is pastoral sufficiency. Caring for people's souls is what we do. We don't ever lose sight of that. We have a responsibility to minister to people's needs, to address real life concerns in people's lives, to help them understand how the gospel can be brought to bear upon their family. We have a responsibility to pastorally care for people. We have to meet them where they are. And that means we have to shepherd people through grief and through aging and through challenges physically and through difficult emotional times. We've got to shepherd them with family problems and marital problems. We've got to shepherd them as their children are being reared and they go through different stages of parenting. We've got to help shepherd them when they go through challenges in their jobs, when they deal with brokenness, wherever that brokenness is in their lives. So our church has got to be pastorally sufficient. And so how does that happen? How does it happen in a church our size? This goes all the way back to where we started this discussion, is that the responsibility, the function of my office as the pastor changed just because I'm pastoring a large church? No. The responsibility is still there. But what I have to do is make sure that I'm listening to the admonishment of the Apostle Paul in Ephesians 4, where Paul says God has given these gifted people to the church to equip God's people to do the work of the ministry. And so I take that very seriously. One of the responsibilities I have as the pastor of this church begins with you as staff members. A part of my job is to pastor you first as staff members in this church and pay attention to what your needs are, pray for you, encourage you, make sure that you're experiencing the kind of care that you need as an individual follower of Christ who happens to serve on staff at this church. But also a part of my responsibility is to help encourage you and challenge you as a staff member to do that very same thing for the people you're responsible for. I've got to encourage you to be a pastor to the people that are in your sphere of influence, but also hopefully to mentor you to do the very same thing to the leaders in your particular ministry areas so that they will be helping to pastor the people in this congregation. Now, we do have the added benefit at First Baptist Arlington of having some heritage and history as Baptists because we have our Bible study units and our Sunday school organization. And you know, I grew up in that culture. Okay, so I grew up in a church that had that just woven into the fabric of who it was. And I've taken it for granted, I would tell you, most of my ministry life. I was at a leadership meeting a few years ago, and we were in Colorado Springs, and I was meeting with a group of pastors of other large churches, and I was the only Southern Baptist in the group that we were in. These guys were from all different kinds of denominations, and so we were discussing our churches, and I just happened to mention our Sunday school organization, you know, and what we do. And one of the other pastors said, well, so you mean you have Bible study classes on Sunday morning for children? And I said, well, sure, yes, we do. I said, but we also have it for adults. He said, well, what do you mean? He said, you mean while church is going on, you have Bible study? And I looked at him with the strangest look because I had never given this a thought. I've just grown up taking it for granted. And I said, well, sure we do. He said, well, where do you put them? To which one of the other pastors said, don't you know anything about Southern Baptists? They build schools for their adults, kind of like a college campus. And this guy looked at me and said, do you have a college campus? I said, no, I don't have a college campus. He said, well, what do you have? I said, well, we have educational buildings with, well, classrooms that adults meet in and are taught. I said, well, okay, yeah, I guess we do. But I've never thought about it that way. That's not what we call it. I said, there's Sunday school buildings. That's what we have. And it just struck me at what a stroke of brilliance that's been for us. Because not only is that the place where the Bible is taught, that's where ministry is done. The pastoral care of our people is actually organized through that arm of the church for the most part. And we don't need to take that for granted. And so that's why it's important for leaders in our church, lay leaders in our church, to see themselves as ministers in this place who are actually helping to provide pastoral care so that we can be pastorally sufficient. It starts with me, I am the pastor, but it touches all of you as staff members. It then goes to our lay leaders so that the work of God from a pastoral perspective can take place in this church. That means that we've got to continue to pay attention to that, to equip our people. This is a church that pays attention to people. I believe that about us. We're going to continue to give grace and acceptance and love. That's one of my goals as the pastor of First Baptist Arlington, is to make sure that happens. So I would tell you, what I've sat down and thought about, what is it that I'm trying to do on a daily basis? I've listened to what Eugene Peterson says, and Eugene Peterson's indictment is, I'm not sure what you're doing, but you're not doing what pastors are supposed to be doing. That's his comment. So I've looked at that and said, okay, well, what's my response to that? Well, my response to that is I'm striving to foster biblical literacy and doctrinal competency and spiritual maturity and missional community and pastoral sufficiency in this local congregation of believers. And I'm doing that personally in the work that I do on a daily basis, And I'm doing that professionally, I believe, in the role that I play in my relationships with you as staff members, as well as in the role that I have in the lives of our lay leaders. So, that, in summary, is my philosophy of ministry from a pastoral perspective.